Hi, we're Allies for Immigration Justice. We're happy to be presenting a brief history of asylum seeking, its root causes, history of our policy, and some stories from the border with you today. Our group is thrilled to be able to join in the work of local education and advocacy in the important and complex areas of immigration policy and impact. Before we begin our presentation, we want to recognize that this university exists on the unceded land of the Chumash peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Chumash community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations, as a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. My name is Selena Lindahl. I teach economics here at Cal Poly. Each of the other members will introduce themselves as they present. We are a small group that tries to collaborate with others to educate the public and support local immigrant communities. This presentation contains stories of refugee trauma, police violence, and incarceration, with which some of you may personally connect. Please reach out to your campus health center counseling services or the Dream Center for someone to talk with if you need. Our hope is that you find this presentation about immigration issues as compelling as we find our work to be. If you do, we welcome your involvement. At the end of the presentation and on your handouts, there are details and ideas for you. There is also a new club starting right now at Cal Poly around these issues. We will have a question and answer period at the end, and we'd love to hear any questions you might have. Thanks for joining us. I'll hand it off to Douglas Pillsbury, who will start us off.
Hi, I'm Douglas Pillsbury. I taught English as a second language at Cuesta College and helped develop the ESL program there. When I retired from teaching, I took the opportunity to learn more about immigration and why people are currently coming to the U.S. I'll be presenting part 1, focusing on root causes of immigration. But first, I'd like to say something about our group's mission. One of our goals is to educate ourselves on what the immigration system is and how it affects people. Another goal is to reach out to other people about this topic. Each of the allies has made at least one trip to the border this past year. Generally, we do some kind of fundraising prior to each trip in order to give financial support and supplies to the organizations that we visit. The goal of these trips is to meet the folks who are doing boots-on-the-ground work with immigrants. We're trying to gain a deeper understanding of exactly what is going on, the policies that are being enacted, and the impact that these policies are having on people's lives. We understand that the issue of immigration is extremely complex, and we hope to share some of that complexity with you today. We realize that this is a controversial topic, one that triggers people on both sides of the issue. In fact, there are many sides to this issue, not just two. There is a spectrum that we all fall on. It's very likely that there are many viewpoints in this room today. From our name, Allies for Immigration Justice, I'm sure it's clear to all of you that we have a particular viewpoint. However, it may surprise you that even within our group, our viewpoints fall on a spectrum. Not everyone is always going to agree on the issues, but we think that the universal need for respecting people and ensuring dignity for people is something we can all identify with and get behind, regardless of differing opinions. It is our hope that we can stand together on that common ground. Our presentation is broken down in 3 parts. In part 1, we'll be looking at some of the root causes of immigration. Then in part 2, explain a little about immigration policy as it pertains to asylum seekers. And finally, we share some stories and images from the border in part 3. Throughout the presentation, we'll be sharing ways you can help if you feel moved to do so. It is likely that some of you have taken a class which has studied Latin American history or politics. However, some of you might be hearing this for the first time. Before we look at the root causes of why people are fleeing their countries, let's look at what defines being an asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is someone who is seeking international protection from dangers in his or her home country. According to international law, and until recently according to U.S. law, they must apply for asylum in the country of destination, meaning they must arrive at or cross a border in order to apply. Asylum seekers are different from refugees, in that refugees apply from outside of the country and are vetted prior to admission. Those arriving at the U.S. border are being depicted as illegal immigrants. But until recently, crossing an international border for asylum was not illegal, and according to U.S. and international law, an asylum seeker's case must be heard. The current administration is in the process of redefining these parameters for seeking asylum, and we'll be discussing that later in this presentation. So now let's look at some root causes. The demographic of those coming to the U.S. has changed. It used to be single males looking for work, coming from Mexico. They were migrating, but they weren't generally seeking asylum. Things have stabilized in that country over the past decade, and the numbers of Mexican males crossing for that reason has dropped dramatically. However, from the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, people are being forced from their lands, and families are fleeing domestic and gang violence, hoping to find a more secure life here. In addition to the Northern Triangle migration, refugees are also coming from Haiti. You might all recall the devastating earthquake in Haiti in 2010. Followed by Hurricane Matthew a few years later. Thousands of Haitians left the island looking for work. Brazil offered several thousand work visas to help build the Olympic stadiums and World Cup projects. When these jobs ended in 2016, Haitians began a 7,000-mile journey to the Mexico-U.S. border. They were hoping to reunite with relatives in New York and Florida. As the door to entering the U.S. began closing, thousands of Haitians found themselves stuck in Tijuana, their lives on hold. We cannot talk about asylum seekers without knowing and understanding what's happening in their countries. For example, Guatemala and Honduras have two of the highest femicide rates in the world. Femicide is a sex-based hate crime term, broadly defined as, quote, the intentional killing of females, women or girls, because they are females, end quote. During the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted from 1960 to 1996, sexual violence was used as a tool of war. Soldiers were trained to commit acts of violence against women as part of warfare. When the men came home from war, there were no programs or support for readjusting. Because a culture of machismo already existed, the outcome was the creation of a culture of violence towards women, including wives, girlfriends, and mothers. The police do very little when someone reports a crime of domestic violence. As Selena mentioned earlier, the Allies initially met when we all came together, along with other community members, to support a Guatemalan woman who is seeking asylum with her 2 young children. She left her country due to domestic violence. There is an ongoing fundraiser to help support the family as they wait for their day in court, and you can find that link on our action handout as well as on our website. MS-13 is an international drug cartel. They first appeared in Los Angeles during the 1980s. In the early 2000s, the group expanded into Central America. They saw opportunity to grow in places where governments were already corrupt and resources and people could be easily exploited. Crime across Central American cities increased. The homicide rate in El Salvador doubled between 2000 and 2009. Indictments for government corruption and murder are rare in Central America. As a result, criminals can extort, threaten, and kill without consequences. As an example, in 2014, 99% of all murders in Honduras went unsolved. It should be noted that the U.S. provides a ready market for the drugs coming out of the Northern Triangle countries. A military coup in Honduras in 2009 overthrew the democratically elected president. Then Juan Orlando Hernandez was elected amidst claims of election fraud. His second election, swiftly endorsed by the U.S. government, was widely perceived as fraudulent by the opposition party as well as by international observers. This led to mass protests and dozens of deaths at the hands of the police. Hernandez's critics have been routinely threatened, jailed, or attacked. Hondurans who oppose Hernandez say U.S. taxpayers are paying for their oppression. There is an aid plan between the United States and the Northern Triangle countries. Its original purpose was to help curb migration. However, over half of the $750 million aid budget is now spent on security and military forces for the purposes of suppression. Honduras remains the most economically unequal country in Latin America, with a high percentage of people living in poverty. Environmentalists, human rights activists, and journalists suffer violence and death without consequence. Indigenous people, as well as women and LGBTQ folks, suffer increasingly under the present regime, and this leads people to flee the country. Since the 2009 coup, Honduras has witnessed an explosive growth in major projects that would displace indigenous communities. There is actually a legal process in place for getting input from people affected by these projects. However, the government has bypassed public input and approved more than 150 dam projects around the country. They have privatized rivers and land and uprooted communities. Since 2010, more than 120 people have been killed in Honduras for protesting against companies that pollute the environment. Berta Cáceres was an internationally recognized Honduran environmental activist and indigenous leader. She led protests for 10 years to block construction of a dam that would have flooded large areas of land where indigenous people have lived for centuries. Berta Cáceres was assassinated in 2016. Largely due to international outrage and pressure, Honduran courts have convicted and sentenced 7 people up to 50 years in prison. This included top employees of the hydroelectric company building the dam and their hired hitmen. 2 of the employees convicted were trained at School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia. If you aren't familiar with School of the Americas, we don't have time to talk about it today, but we recommend that you go home and Google it. Widespread displacement of indigenous peoples from their ancestral homes in Honduras and Guatemala is one major factor leading to migration. Due to time constraints, we aren't spending a lot of time on the history of U.S. involvement in Latin America today. If you are interested in learning about how our government's foreign policy over many decades has contributed to the current political instability in the area, Harvest of Empire is an excellent film that you can stream online. It is listed on our action handout. The most vulnerable people to the effects of climate change are those living in the world's poorest countries. Increasingly unpredictable weather patterns, shifting seasons, and natural disasters disproportionately threaten these populations. This region in Central America, known as the Dry Corridor, has been experiencing severe droughts and floods, all exacerbated by the climate crises. And these changes threaten the physical, financial, and mental well-being of the people who live there. For example, study after study has laid out the threat that climate change poses to the coffee industry around the world. Rising temperatures are bringing drought, increasing the range of diseases, and killing the insects that pollinate coffee plants. More than 30% of jobs in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are in agriculture. Immigration analysts point to the fact that about half the adults apprehended at the U.S. border work in agriculture. These studies are backed up by the stories coming out of Northern Triangle countries. People are losing their farms and their livelihoods and migrating from rural to urban areas. Ultimately, because of the violence in the cities, many are migrating out of their countries and coming to the U.S. To end this section on root causes, we'd like to share a short film that relates an immigrant's experience. This is a story about Ada and her 3-year-old son, Brian. Ada and her son fled their home in Central America after gangs threatened them. In this film, Ada and Brian have found temporary shelter and protection at a transit shelter in Mexico.
Se acercó una muchacha y me dice, ¿qué te pasa? ¿Por qué lloras? Le digo, es que la verdad, yo ando aquí, no sé para dónde ir, no sé para dónde voy. Y ando con mi hijo. Y lo que me duele es verlo a él ahí, él lloraba, que me decía que tenía hambre. Me golpeaban igual, me gritaban groserías, luego que el impuesto de guerra, que yo no sabía que tenía que pagar impuesto de guerra. Lo único que le pedía a Dios, que no se abriera la puerta, el niño bien asustado, el niño me gritaba, mami, llorando. O yo sé que si yo abría la puerta me podían ultrajarme a mí o me le podían hacer daño al niño, solamente para cobrarse lo que es el impuesto de guerra. Entonces no tuve de otra opción, le pedí tanto a Dios que se fueran ellos y tomé una mochila, eché lo que pude y salí. Yo salí a las 3 de la mañana, salí y me escondí en esa caseta. El niño tenía bastante frío, entonces estaba esperando a que pasara el primer autobús a esa hora. Solamente pensé en salvarle la vida a mi hijo, porque tenía miedo a que se cobraran con él o conmigo, que me podían. Ellos cuando les deben el impuesto de guerra, ellos a veces, si son mujeres, las ultrajan o las hacen sus mujeres para que, entonces, la verdad yo no quería eso. Yo he trabajado muy duro para que al final me pase eso. La verdad que me he sentido muy bien aquí. Hay veces que me preguntan, ¿vas para arriba? Yo les digo la verdad que yo no tengo sueño americano. Yo no decidí estar aquí. Yo lo hice porque tenía que salir. En estos caminos, la verdad que se sufre bastante. Aquí les dan donde pueden descansar, comida. Ellos cuando vienen, yo siempre he escuchado que dicen gracias a estos albergues uno tiene donde descansar, donde pueden estar seguros sin que vayan a agarrarlos.
So, Douglas talked a little about root causes, and in part 2, we are going to take a look at current U.S. immigration policy. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Mary Lynn Crandall, and I'm a retired primary school teacher. After getting my teaching degree, I lived in Mexico and in the Canary Islands, learned to speak Spanish, and taught in both places. Back in the States, I worked as a bilingual educator in Guadalupe and then in the Santa Maria Bonita School District until the late 1990s, when California did away with bilingual education. Later, I left the classroom to run the independent study program for the district and continued to work closely with Latino students and their families in that capacity. In large part, it is those past relationships that drive my interest in this area now. Let's take a look at the process for seeking asylum prior to 2016. After presenting themselves at the border and requesting asylum seekers go through a process called a credible fear interview. At that time, they must demonstrate a well-founded fear that if they are deported home, they will face persecution, as we spoke about in Part 1. In the past, if the asylum seeker passed the credible fear screening, they were typically processed in one of two ways. In what was referred to as the Safe Release Program, people were given an ankle monitor and a court date. Generally, agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, would ensure that new arrivals could connect with relatives and supporters within the country. The second option typically was that they were detained in the immigration detention system until their court hearing. The photo you are looking at here is the Mesa Verde Detention Center in Bakersfield, where our Allies group makes monthly visits to people in immigration detention. Those visits have been halted due to COVID-19, but if you would like to visit with us sometime, Jan Meslin from our group is the coordinator. For more information about detention visitation at Mesa Verde, her contact email is listed on the actions page that we will be sharing with you. She'll also be talking more later about the work she has done volunteering with an organization called Freedom for Immigrants in Orange County. What do you know about the immigration detention system? Let's go over some facts together. 40 years ago, the immigration detention system did not exist. When it was first begun in the 1980s, the system was used for those who were considered a flight risk. Since that time, this industry has grown into a multi-billion-dollar for-profit industry built on the incarceration of immigrants. GEO Group and CoreCivic are the two major corporations running private detention centers in the United States. For the past 3 decades, they have spent $25 million on lobbying legislators to expand the number of beds. In 1980, there were about 4,000 detention beds in the entire country, and over the past 3 decades, the number of beds has been expanded to about 55,000. These detention centers are paid for with our tax dollars, and because these are private companies, their shares are traded on the stock exchange. As with any other stock that is traded, they are beholden to their shareholders to show a profit. Because it is civil detention, there is no federal limit to how long an immigrant can be detained without trial. Some are able to be bonded out and go to live with family while waiting for their case to be heard. However, most cannot afford to bond out. Immigrants who are unable to make bail can spend months or even years in detention, awaiting their court date. Civil detention is not supposed to be punitive, but even though the images on this slide may appear to show pleasant surroundings, the stories of the suffering coming out of the detention centers is very real and point to lack of oversight and regulation. Numerous federal lawsuits have alleged human rights abuses in CoreCivic and GEO Group facilities. Complaints include poor conditions and abuse, including thousands of people who have alleged sexual and physical abuse. And as for a COVID-19 update, according to Amnesty International, in a report released this month, there are 40,000 people in over 200 centers across the country. There have been numerous reports that these facilities are failing to provide even the most basic precautionary measures, such as hand sanitizer and face masks. Social distancing in these environments is impossible, as you can imagine. Amnesty International, along with many other immigrant advocacy organizations, is urging state governors and local authorities to utilize their authority to instruct immigration detention facilities and county and local jails to reduce their immigration detainee occupancy. In October of last year, California's Governor Newsom signed AB 32, a bill that forbids California from renewing or signing any new contracts with for-profit prison companies. AB 32 gives California until 2028 to completely phase out the use of privately owned prisons. However, just days before the new state law was to take effect in January, ICE managed to sign new long-term contracts with 3 private prison companies to operate and to actually expand immigration detention in California. One story that is linked to this new law. McFarland is a small farming community located near Bakersfield, where the Mesa Verde Detention Center is that we showed on the previous slide. McFarland is about 95% Latino, perhaps as many as half of whom are undocumented. In February, 2 proposals that would have led to the opening of 2 immigrant detention facilities in McFarland failed to pass the city's planning commission, largely due to a very large and very vocal opposition to that move. The slide you are looking at is a picture of the crowd outside the meeting, celebrating the vote. However, in April, the City Council held another meeting on Zoom, and another vote was taken. The City Council voted 4-0 in favor of the same 2 proposals. Advocates accused the City Council of intentionally scheduling the vote while California's lockdown was in effect, to ensure that large numbers of demonstrators could not attend. Both supporters and opponents of the plan were called on to speak, but hundreds of people were unable to even listen in because Zoom and telephone lines were jammed. Rural and impoverished cities have increasingly welcomed private prison companies because they bring tax revenue, jobs, and other financial benefits. On a positive note, I'd like to share a couple of examples of how social justice advocacy can work. Late last year, 8 major banks announced they will not grant any more loans to GEO and CoreCivic. This was due to pressure from a coalition of 100 grassroots advocacy organizations. And in the past 2 years, 2 major pension funds in California, CalSTRS and CalPERS, have both divested following intense activism from their members and immigration advocacy groups. Here, we are looking at a chart that shows the immigration policies pertaining to asylum seekers that have been enacted in the past 3 years. For the purpose of time, I'm going to talk about the 2 most recently enacted policies that you see in the red circles on the right: Safe Third Country Rule and the MPP, or Remain in Mexico policies. The first policy was initiated in 2019. This program is called the Migrant Protection Protocols by the Administration, or MPP for short. It is more commonly known as the Remain in Mexico program. Originally, it targeted migrants from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. The program was later expanded to cover anyone from a Spanish-speaking country and most recently included Brazil as well. It requires people to remain in Mexico during their legal proceedings, which can last several months. When you present yourself to request asylum, you are briefly detained, given a court date, and then sent back to Mexico to wait. When it's time to appear before a U.S. immigration judge, asylum seekers must travel back to the port of entry and re-enter custody. At the end of the day's proceedings, they're bused back to Mexico, where they must remain until their next court date. The numerous logistical obstacles under this policy have led thousands of asylum seekers to miss their hearings, resulting in immediate deportation orders. There are other serious problems with the policy as well. Most people do not have a Mexican work authorization, which leaves them with no way to support themselves. Shelters in Mexico are filled beyond their capacities, forcing people to sleep in the streets or in encampments like the one you see in this picture. Mexico faces its own very high level of violence. Some cities to which asylum seekers are being returned are among the most violent in the country, and Tijuana is one of them. Reporters working in the field and human rights organizations tell stories of human trafficking, sexual assault, robbery, kidnapping, extortion, and torture experienced by these migrants as they wait for their court dates. How has COVID-19 impacted those in the Wait in Mexico program? On March 23rd, the DHS and the Department of Justice postponed MPP hearings through April 22nd, and 1 week later extended the cancellation through May 1st. As a result, individuals in MPP are being forced to wait in Mexico for up to 4 months or longer. Many of the asylum seekers living in border towns along the U.S.-Mexico border are dependent on American volunteers for basic necessities and services, but the majority of nonprofits and NGOs that were regularly crossing over the border to work in the migrant camps have stopped coming due to the pandemic. Space in the shelters was already limited, but since the pandemic hit Mexico, many have stopped taking in new arrivals, or are limiting the number of arrivals, or have shut down completely. Medical teams working at the encampments do not have the capability to operate as an ICU, so they're basically preparing themselves to administer palliative care and end-of-life care in the case that an outbreak occurs. Even so, most migrants have chosen to continue to wait in Mexico. There have been a small number of people who have returned to their home countries voluntarily, but for many, going back would mean risking their lives. The second policy that I want to talk about briefly is an asylum ban called the transit ban that was issued in the summer of last year. This ban says that the asylum seeker must apply for asylum in a country that they travel through. The United States has reached an agreement with Guatemala, and under the new rules, Hondurans and Salvadorans must seek asylum in Guatemala or Mexico. Guatemala's constitutional court initially blocked the deal, and our government responded by threatening tariffs on the country. The agreement was eventually signed last July. The U.S. administration has signed a similar safe third country agreements with El Salvador and Honduras. Those have not yet been implemented. Administration officials have expressed plans for Guatemalans to apply for asylum in Mexico and are considering sending Mexican asylum seekers to Guatemala to seek refuge. If and when all of these agreements are implemented, asylum seekers traveling to the United States from the Northern Triangle will be stopped at the southern border of either Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, or Mexico. Implementation of this policy began in November of last year. It has resulted in more than 900 asylum seekers being deported to Guatemala so far from Honduras and El Salvador, people who had arrived at the U.S. border and who were then put on planes and flown to Guatemala. Keep in mind that Guatemala has its own issues. In fiscal 2019, Guatemala was the largest source of migrants detained at the U.S. border. The country has only a skeletal asylum program with fewer than a dozen asylum officers. Similarly to the Wait in Mexico program, the Supreme Court ruled in September to allow the administration to continue this new policy while the legal fight plays out in the courts. Due to COVID-19, as of March, the Guatemalan government suspended accepting flights that were carrying asylum seekers trying to enter the United States, as a way to prevent the spread of the coronavirus within its borders. A separate issue is the continued deportations of Hondurans and Guatemalans, some of whom were sick, from the U.S. to their own countries. The issue of deportees being returned to these countries is especially sensitive as these countries attempt to contain their own coronavirus outbreaks. The health care systems in these poor countries are ill prepared for an outbreak. We put restrictions on flights into the United States to prevent transfer of the coronavirus, but deportation flights continue to go out. In March, ICE completed almost 18,000 removals, according to agency records. The total deportations continued but did decline in April. That ends part 2, the discussion of immigration policy in the United States currently. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jan Meslin, who's going to talk about some of the stories from the border.
Now let's share some border experiences we've had. First, though, let me introduce myself. I'm Jan Meslin, moved to the beautiful Central Coast about a year ago. Like Mary Lynn, immigrant justice became my passion when it became personal to me, when immigrants became my good friends. I volunteered with Freedom for Immigrants for several years. Our mission is to abolish immigration detention in the U.S., and until that happens, we work to end the abuse and isolation of people inside. I've been visiting and advocating for people since 2012 when I helped to found Friends of Orange County Detainees, one of the visitation programs at the more than 200 detention centers throughout the country. In addition to visitation programs, we run a detention hotline, raise money for bond, match sponsors with people inside, file civil rights complaints, and help write new laws. You will find information on our action page on how to get involved. I also help to facilitate 4-day trips to Tijuana, several of which were the impetus for this presentation. There are so many stories. We will share only a few. Greta Soto Moreno is a transgender woman who grew up outside Mexico City. Although Mexican laws protect LGBT people, they are not enforced, and it is often the police who abuse them. She had to present as a man in order to stay safe. She was beaten several times and often harassed. She came across the border in Texas, hoping that she could be her true self in the U.S. Because of the liberal Mexican laws, it is hard for Mexican LGBT people to win asylum, to prove they'll be persecuted if returned to Mexico. When I met Greta in 2016, she had recently been transferred from Eloy Detention Center in Arizona, where she had to live in a men's unit, to one in Orange County where there was a special unit for transgender women. Greta was part of a Freedom for Immigrants strip search civil rights complaint. Policy was to make them remove clothing and be searched each time they went to a class or had a visitor, even their own attorney. It was often male guards who taunted her and took liberties as they searched her. This humiliating abuse caused some of the people detained to avoid visits at all. From the first time I met her, we became fast friends. Freedom for Immigrants was able to get the strip searches stopped, and advocates were able to help her get released on bond in 2017. She now lives in Los Angeles, where she works for a doctor's office and advocates for trans people. She is still working on her asylum case. On one of our trips to the border, we met this beautiful family from Honduras. I think the most courageous people we meet are those who have left everything they know behind to make the long trek to the U.S., simply to find safety. After some of their family members were beaten for not complying with cartel demands, they packed up overnight and fled. Felt fortunate to make it to Tijuana, where they turned themselves in for asylum, and now they are stuck there in the Remain in Mexico program. Try to imagine what they're going through right now. Now we'll take you to one of the more than 30 migrant shelters in Tijuana. This one is located in Scorpion Canyon, or Cañón de Alacrán. It is next to a public dump and a creek that periodically washes out the dirt road, making it difficult to access, especially after winter rains. The shelter is connected to a church called Embajadoras de Jesus, Ambassadors of Jesus. It is run by a married couple, Pastors Gustavo and Zaida, and houses up to 400 Haitians, Africans, and Central Americans. In the video you're going to see now, you will meet Gerline Joseph, who heads up an organization called the Haitian Bridge Alliance. This group assists Haitian and Afro-Caribbean immigrants on both sides of the border. Every week they visit shelters like this one in Tijuana, meeting legal, medical, and humanitarian needs. They also raise money, buy supplies, and bring groups of volunteers like us to the shelters.
Et puis, monté 5 octobre 2016, depuis les acteurs, je séparé, je libéré Madame Natimono, et me déporté. Si vous criez Madame Natimono, criez, mais vous avez fait me déporter. La seule chose que je veux dire, je voulais grandement retrouver quelqu'un qui peut m'aider dans cette situation.
Let's do this real quick. The Haitian Bridge Alliance has been doing work on the border for almost 4 years now. We used to come once a month. That turned into twice a month. That turns into every week. We come to Tijuana and then we buy the things that we donate. We are hoping to be able to provide food for about 120 families plus 400 in the shelter. So hopefully around 500 to 600 people will be providing food for. Over 5,000 Haitians pass through here. And she took care of all of them. Just her and her husband.
Mi esposo muy rápido, porque decía que Dios le estaba diciendo que lo hiciera rápido.
And every time I come here, it's just surreal.
How are you raising?
That's a great question. It has all been out of pocket. And people think that Haitian Bridge Alliance have tens of thousands of people. We are a team of 5. How do we do it? I don't know. But we are doing it.
The best way to help this shelter is to either donate to the Haitian Bridge Alliance or to the Caravan of Love / Caravan Without Borders. The links to both are included on our Actions handout. About 3,000 Haitians have given up on the asylum process and have settled in Tijuana to make a life for themselves there. The community of Little Haiti, also in Scorpion Canyon, serves as home base for some of these migrants. Barbershops, restaurants, and other Haitian-owned businesses have sprung up to serve fellow Haitians as well as locals. Okay, it's time to shock some of you. Please raise your hands. Yes, even if you're watching on your computer screen. Please raise your hands if you know that the U.S. is deporting veterans. Have you heard that? Yes, people who have enlisted, gone to war, been discharged honorably, then deported to all over the world. Many on our border trips are especially moved by visits we make to the U.S. deported veterans in Tijuana. They advocate for these undocumented men and women who have served honorably in the U.S. military. They also support deported veterans who are having a hard time adjusting to life outside the U.S. Often they must leave their families, jobs, and other support systems. U.S. deported veterans work toward a day when all veterans can come home if they want to. During our visits, co-directors Hector Lopez and Robert Vivar explained to us how U.S. veterans get deported. Legal permanent residents or green card holders join the military, often are promised a fast-track path to citizenship. They're willing to die for our country. Many are under the false impression that once honorably discharged, they will automatically become citizens. As you probably know, many veterans who return from serving in war-torn countries have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. If not treated properly, it can lead to self-medication and run-ins with the legal system. Veterans who aren't citizens and find themselves in this predicament will all of a sudden be in the detention and deportation system, even for very minor crimes. The U.S. deported veterans educate the public, hoping we will become advocates when we return home to the U.S. Often, local deported veterans come in and share their stories with us. The Department of Homeland Security keeps no public records on which veterans have been deported, but we know they're all over the world. Estimates range from 2,000 to 3,000. One of the first was our friend Ruben, a Vietnam-era veteran who was deported in 1998, soon after that 1996 law that made it easier to deport people. Right now, about 40 deported veterans live in Tijuana. Hector always tells us how ironic it is that the only way now he can come home to his family in the U.S. is after he dies. He will get a hero's burial from the U.S. military. Miguel Perez is a Mexican native who grew up in Chicago. He enlisted in the military and served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He suffered a traumatic brain injury from combat. Upon returning home, he struggled with PTSD, battling depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Those struggles led to a drug-related conviction that landed him in state prison for 7 years. Then, rather than going on to parole, which he would have done if he was a U.S. citizen, he was put right in immigration detention and deported after 1 year. While in Tijuana, his family and friends, along with his church community and Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth, herself a veteran, fought hard for him. These all impacted his case, and he was pardoned by the governor of Illinois in September 2019. He returned to Chicago and recently became a U.S. citizen. Al Otro Lado, which means to the other side in Spanish, is a nonprofit social justice legal services organization. Some amazing and courageous young attorneys, mostly women, run the place. They provide cross-border legal services to asylum seekers, refugees, and other migrants. They document human rights violations committed against asylum seekers at the port of entry and also inside detention centers. They currently are part of 4 class action suits against the U.S. government. One of them, MPP, or Remain in Mexico, was just overturned in federal court last week, as we heard earlier from Mary Lynn. Al Otro Lado needs volunteers. They prefer week-long visits, which include a training at the beginning. Spanish speaking is not required. You may have read about another victory Al Otro Lado had in the courts. Their advocacy helped 9 parents who had been illegally deported to Central America come back to the U.S. and reunite with their children who had been taken from them at the border. David Zoll, whom you see here with his son, was one of the 9 parents who arrived from Guatemala in January of this year. Nearly 2 years before, he arrived with his son, then 7, and asked for asylum. David signed a form that he believed would allow him to leave the country with his son, but instead he was deported and his son remained here. In September of last year, the court found Zoll's removal to be unlawful because he had not withdrawn his asylum claim voluntarily. His son Bryant spent a year in various shelters. As happy as they are to be reunited, it's really the beginning of a whole new journey for these 9 parents and their children who have been highly traumatized. Migrant advocates say the administration continues to quietly separate hundreds of families. In the last 3 years, at least 471 parents were deported without their children, and not all are reunited. We hope this case sets a precedent for more reunifications. This is a view of the border wall on the Tijuana side, looking toward the Pacific Ocean. In 1994, under the Clinton administration, Operation Gatekeeper began, a strategy of control through deterrence that involved constructing fences and militarizing the southern border where it was most easily crossed. In Tijuana, the U.S.-Mexico border wall runs right through the middle of a plaza called Friendship Park. On weekends, the park is a meeting spot for people who have been separated from their loved ones by the wall. From the U.S. side, visitation time at Friendship Park is limited to Saturdays and Sundays, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., and only 10 adults are allowed to access the park at any given time. The section of the wall that bisects Friendship Park is a metal grid so restrictive that a pinky finger can barely fit through. Locals coined the term pinky kiss to describe the only physical contact that is possible through the wall. The wall was built to keep people out. But instead of deterring migrants desperate to cross, the migration route shifted to more dangerous terrain, the deserts and mountains. In spring and summer months, temperatures can reach 127 degrees. People die of heat stroke, dehydration, and hypothermia. Since the immigrant caravans arrived in October 2017, Hugo Castro, who worked with Border Angels, has been organizing a Caravan of Love from San Diego. Volunteers caravan from shelter to shelter in Tijuana, bringing much-needed supplies, including food and clothing, first aid, hygiene items, and now masks. Just last month, the name was changed to Caravan Without Borders. But the links on our action sheet still work. Join a Caravan of Love, Caravan Without Borders. Check out their Facebook page or website for details and dates. Casas de Luz is the last nonprofit we will talk about. This project helps people who need housing, often after they've been deported. We share it because it is an easy way for young people to make a difference in a family's life in one weekend, and it doesn't cost much money. Casa de Luz brings youth and adults from the U.S. and Mexico together to build. Expertise and building materials from both sides of the border are used. Donations from the U.S. provide doors, windows, cabinets, furniture, appliances, and more in order to furnish the homes. Their vision is to empower individuals and families on both sides of the border to recognize their potential and to create change in this world. The Casas de Luz website is listed on the action handout and gives very thorough information about what's involved if you want to volunteer. We end our presentation at the border wall. Since 2011, a binational and bilingual worship service has been held every Sunday. Known as Border Church, you will see music, communion, colorful posters, and food on the Mexican side. Added recently is a border mosque. Once per month, Muslims and Christians worship together at this beautiful spot. In closing, we'd like to share a poem with you. In the Mayan tradition, there's a greeting in Lakesh, which means, I am you and you are me. In other words, it is a statement of unity and oneness. Note the sign on the wall, which says in Spanish, Eres mi otro yo. You are my other me. This is a line from a multilingual poem written by Chicano playwright Luis Valdez. It instills ideas of empathy and integrity, which Valdez based on philosophical concepts from the ancient Maya. Hi, thank you for listening to our presentation. I'm Gina Whitaker, a member of Allies for Immigration Justice Steering Committee. I've been a social justice activist since the 60s. After many decades of work for human and civil rights, policy change, and anti-oppression work, I've lately been focusing on immigration justice. I'm interested in helping people like you understand the plight of those who are trying to better their lives by coming to live and work in the United States. I also want to help you take direct actions that will help our immigrant neighbors realize their better life. U.S. immigration practices are changing almost daily under our current administration, now using the COVID-19 pandemic as an excuse. Some of what you heard today may have radically changed in present-day practice. Asylum seekers, as well as refugees, permanent legal residents, green card holders, DACA recipients, temporary workers, and undocumented people are all being affected. Bans too numerous to track are instituted, and then often stayed or found unconstitutional by courts day to day. We hope this presentation has piqued your interest in learning more. Ms. Bartlett will be sharing an action sheet from us. I would like to highlight 5 important items on this list. Sign up for our Allies newsletter. Go to our website, alliesforimmigrationjustice.org, and sign up for our occasional newsletter to keep up to date on actions and issues. Call elected officials, don't email. Calling cannot be done too often. Calling has been proven to be the most effective way to influence politicians. These calls are tallied, and you can be sure that the opposition is also calling. A call should take less than 1 minute. You'll be talking to a staffer, so make your point succinctly and be sure to cite the name or number of the bill you're calling about. Messages can be left after hours if you prefer. Artivism Project. This community project incorporates both art and activism. It's taking shape and will be an exciting way to participate. Contact Selena or Jan. Their contact information is on the action sheet. There's a new club in town, a Cal Poly campus club called Students for Immigration Justice, a brand new club that's just formed, open to everyone. If interested, contact either Jessica Garces or Nishanth Narayan, club officers whose contacts are on the action sheet. SLO County Undocu Support Fund. This is a brand new effort of 12 local agencies to help the thousands of undocumented people in our county cope with the effects of COVID-19. Undocumented people and families with even one undocumented person are ineligible for any of the federal aid now being offered. These are working people trying to feed their families while paying high rents on low wages, and often with no health insurance. They cannot collect unemployment insurance or any stimulus money. Go to the link on your action sheet and make your donation to the SLO Community Foundation's Disaster Relief Fund. List SLO County Undocu Support in the comment box. Even a small donation will help. The link is on your action sheet. Thanks for your attention. We hope the information we've provided is valuable. We'll take questions now from students or from Ms. Bartlett.